for posterity. Okay. We are now recording. After the presentation, we'll spend a little bit of time in some discussion. Just be thinking of, thoughts, questions, topics that we could maybe discuss during that time. After we've gone through that discussion, then I'll pull Angie and Joe out of the session for about 15 minutes. I guess Mary, Lowell, and myself, we have to function as a voting committee. So we'll discuss the project, etc., for about 15 minutes. Then I'll bring you guys back into the session and give you the results. Okay?
Right.
All right. Well, Angie, take it away.
Okay. And I know all of you have read my dissertation, and so
a few times each.
I know. You especially, right? So,
probably.
So my understanding is I won't spend too much time on a whole lot of the details regarding the project, and hopefully what I'm covering here will provide you what you're looking for this part of the review. So beginning, Disparity Matters, as you know, is the title of my project, the church's call to understand the systemic influence of power and money in Fort Wayne, Indiana. The presentation will have basically 3 components to it. The first is basic overview of the project and why it matters, the process and methodology that I used, and then the outcomes and next steps. So the backdrop to the project, as I know you've all read, includes my experiences personally growing up up to this point in life, basically from childhood, the experiences I had as a young adult and teacher in Southern California, working in the community, and just one of the threads running throughout that is the sense of the other, and just experiencing for myself what that means, but then also observing that in other people's experiences as well, what that meant to me as both, and depending on the circumstances, both either a female or someone that came from sort of under-resourced family setting, and just being different. And so living in California especially, that opened my eyes to more of that with the variety of people that I was around and worked with and got to know. So there's just been a growing and developing and constant thread of this sense of other, and then the differences that are associated and highlighted as a result of that. Seeing the challenges in life as part of the systems that are a part of being the other and that people face each day, and a growing kind of wrestling and discontent with understanding then what does it mean to love the Lord your God and your neighbor, as we're told are the greatest commandments. So working in the community, experiencing some of the challenges with people, as well as the ones that I have encountered over time, developing questions. Why was I observing, at times even a disinterest or an unconcern, particularly among Christians, regarding the systemic challenges that people face in our communities? And some of those questions that surfaced and developed included why? Why is this the case? What are those differences in perspectives? Why are they different? Why do we have such polarized positions and views? The question, what are those contributions to those not only disparate experiences, but also the points of view, and trying to make sense of what is it we're not understanding together that would give us a common look or perspective, and being able to address and understand maybe history or our purpose as believers, and also presuppositions that each of us bring into the different scenarios of society. And then also how have these things contributed to what I had been observing in the wrestling that I had been dealing with. Basically, those things combined led me to continue to question how power and money, what I finally figured out, I guess, was my curiosity, because it seemed to be those seemed to be a common thread that ran through everything. Power and money and the influence of those things in our lives and in society, and then looking at our purpose and the theology behind what we maybe should be understanding as Christians. So that grew into this question: in what ways have power and money impacted the current context, current conditions of disparity in Fort Wayne and how might the church, and I can't see all of my slide because of this. I'm going to see if I can move that. Okay, seek the shalom within the context. Related questions revolve around how do residents of Fort Wayne perceive or understand the nature of disparity? What does current demographic data and disparity look like in Fort Wayne, and how have historical influences contributed to the current constructs? So my primary audience was the church, or fellow Christians, and also general community members, leaders within our community in Fort Wayne. My role served as facilitator, researcher, and catalyst. My hope was that, much like, as I've pulled from Acts 2, much like the people asked Peter, "Brothers, what shall we do then?" I'm hoping that Christians will begin to ask a similar question as they begin to grapple with the realities of disparity. So toward transformation, the purpose is to evoke curiosity and concern about disparity, to collectively explore these issues, and then to produce the toolkit that I believe will be ever evolving. Really, it was a three-pronged approach in working towards uncovering or digging into this topic. The quote from Dallas Willard, I think, kind of captures the essence of what I believe to be true about this. And understanding is the basis of care. What you would take care of, you must first understand, whether it be a petunia, a person, or a nation. So I felt that history was significant to take a look at, looking back to our past. Theology, of course. What does God have to say about these things? And then our current context here in Fort Wayne, all then related to the issues of race, gender, and economics, the disparate issues revolving around those. Process and methodology, for the most part, was built around the constructivist approach to learning, which is looking at what you know or think you know and establishing a foundation of knowledge and experience, but then asking questions about it and then beginning to explore and research those things. And as part of the process to discuss and reflect what it is you're exploring and researching, and continuing to build on that understanding and knowledge in a spiral effect, as the image kind of illustrates there. So the stages in the figure here on the left basically outline, moving from stage 1 at the very beginning with the introduction to the project and getting a context for my focus group members, all the way through to the end in stage 7, the culmination of the outcome of the dissertation, the toolkit, and then trying to additionally continue to evaluate and synthesize and strategize. Okay, so now what? Contributions to the project included, of course, a number of different sources. So everything from books to conversations, historical documents, articles, the theological study, drawing upon personal experience and connecting the dots for not only myself, but then my focus group members as well, using video emails, documents and spreadsheets that we shared, mapping together, small group meetings. There's a lot of electronic communication as well as face-to-face. And then the evaluation process included utilizing surveys, the reflections that I received from my focus group, including my own, the interviews and conversations, and then measuring these things and allowing those to inform related to the stated objectives of the project. What worked well with this project, I believe, included actually the electronic communication. It wasn't what I imagined being the primary means, but it ended up working very well. I think because it was easy and convenient for everybody. It allowed for their schedules, which allowed them to be more committed to the process, actually, and engaged to be able to reflect on their own time. The focus group was great. They were reflective and honest, and they had a lot of meaningful things to share and exchange with me and each other. It came from a variety of contexts, which I think both was something good and maybe impacted it in, as you can see on the other side, I'll talk about in a moment. But the variety of context, I think, was important because of what they brought to the conversation and just the way that they could perceive or understand the community as well. Surveys were great. They were easy and tangible. The content, there was a lot to choose from. So that was great. There's been a lot of recent research, which was interesting to dig into. Challenges included people's schedules, basically the time and distance. It wasn't easy to convene together. The diversity of the focus group was not very diverse. It ended up being an all-white group, which was not what the original intention was, but that's what it ended up being. And because they were from the different contexts, we lacked a singular focus on tackling something together. So it served both as a good and maybe challenging thing. Of course, this has just additionally prompted more questions. And had I known then what I know now, I probably would have structured a few things differently because of that, including the timeline, but you don't know what you don't know. And life, of course, is full of interruptions, both for myself and my focus group members. One of the areas that surfaced throughout as a common or a dominant theme in terms of disparity was that of property and neighbor. In a recent article, the author writes, housing is at once a basic mode of shelter and a form of investment. As this basic necessity has been transformed over time, it is an instrument, financial instrument, and source of wealth. Not only has housing inequality increased, but housing inequality has become a major contributor to, if not a major overall factor, in wealth inequality. When you consider, and I think this part is important, when you consider the fact that what is a necessity for everyone has been turned into a financial instrument for a select few, this is no surprise. And so I think that housing is something that touches on each of those three prongs that was a part of this project: history, theology, and our local context. It really does touch on so many different aspects of looking at disparity through these various lenses of what theologically, what Scripture has to say about it, particularly principles coming out of the Old Testament, the history aspect, and then also just how we understand debt and money and our stewardship that we've been given. And just it becomes an issue of a concentration then of wealth and power, just policies and practices. So it's so interconnected to so many different things. Our focus group took a look at housing, one of the lenses they looked through. And so we plotted on these maps. The map to the left shows where focus group members lived on a map that shows race and ethnicity, where the darkest colors represent the white population. So the darker the color, the more of the population is white. On the map on the right, it's a map of household income. And the lighter the color, the lower the income. And the darker the color, the greater the income. And so you can see that our focus group members predominantly lived in mostly white and mostly wealthier neighborhood tracts. So this was interesting to me in relation to the redlining practices that were very common in the early part of the 20th century, especially during the New Deal era, 1930s. So the map on the left shows a redlining map where the grades are indicated on the key, green and blue being the best, yellow and red being the worst, thus redlining. And the map on the right shows within the current city limits, the circle indicates where that redlining map predominantly is structured. So the colors from the redlining map would exist today within that circle. Today's property values then, in contrast, if you look in this map on the top right here with the circle, and then look over to the center map here with the zip codes and such, we can see where 803, 806, 807 exist, and the data for those areas are by far less than what the other areas in the city are today, sometimes 2 to 3 times difference in both value and median list price, and that was as of late 2017. So I doubt those numbers have changed much since then, if any. So looking at race and ethnicity by tract, like the map I mentioned earlier, where the white and non-white population can be seen. Households with children by tract, darker the color, the more children. Population density by tract, so the darker the shade, the more dense the population. And median household income, again, darker shade, higher income. There are some conclusions that are interesting to me and I think are worth noting because it looks as though the households with the most children tend to live in communities where there are fewer white households, where there's also a higher concentration of the population, and where there is the lowest earning households. There were a lot of outcomes and a lot of highlights that surfaced through this research. I've highlighted a few here. One aspect that wasn't included in the previous information, though, was that our population in Fort Wayne among students right now show that an almost equal number of white and non-white students live in our city limits. And so if that trend continues, that should tell us something about the trend towards a diversification of our population in Fort Wayne. Black households are disproportionately in the bottom income brackets. There are more than 4 times as many single mother households than there are single father households. Women tend to earn less, and elected representation does not adequately or fairly reflect the composition of our population. And I do appreciate one of the aspects that Robert Linthicum points out in terms of the religious aspect of our society does highly influence the other, if not more than the other, influence issues of disparity. So what we believe really does influence everything that we do as a society. And so I think that that's one of the reasons why it's significant for the church to consider these things. Our focus group reflections on everything that we covered throughout the project were really interesting to me. And like I said, I think they were thoughtful and meaningful. We seem to self-segregate. For the white population and the privileged, our systems aren't broken enough to want to fix them. The inferior neighborhoods are predominantly occupied by minorities or poor populations. And so I think that they really did begin asking questions. How can the church continue to ignore and miss the overwhelming data concerning disparity? The feelings that were evoked, I thought were important because I wanted to gauge how all of this made them feel. There was a lot of polarization in social media today. One of the focus group members commented, "It may fall under encouragement, but it made me want to do better." So I thought that was encouraging for me even. They could have chosen anger, curiosity, frustration, enlightenment, encouragement, intrigue, and no one was suspicious, which was interesting. But most of their comments were similar to these. When I read, it feels like these issues are so systemic. They're deep-seated in our country. I want to play a role in being part of the solution, but it's difficult to know where to begin or how to break free from the system. So they really did see things systemically. And so they began to ask more questions. If disparity is so ingrained, how do we change it? And finally, one person said, "Okay, I get it. Now what? How do I change my perspective and make a difference that is meaningful and not just something I do to check on a list and make me feel better about myself and my faith? Do I really get it at all?" And looking back at the project goals, brothers, what shall we do? I did think that that was something that our focus group came to. What do we do about this? And towards transformation, it did evoke curiosity and concern about disparity among all of us. Collectively, we explored the issues of disparity in Fort Wayne, and which led to the production of a toolkit, as I said, is ever evolving. And I used some of the feedback, or let the feedback from my surveys guide what type of tools and resources to utilize within that toolkit. My personal reflections for my own transformational journey include definitely a clarity and articulation of purpose and my own sense of calling. I have an expanded knowledge of history and social sciences, which are my background, not so much history in the past, but social sciences for sure. And I feel like this really gave me an opportunity to dig in more deeply to those things and to dig in deeper to my development of theology and a continuity of my understanding of a variety of things theologically. There is a strong foundation for further work and research that I am very intrigued about and I have a passion for now. And moving forward and tackling issues of disparity, I'm trying to discern now next steps and continue what I do next. So working with the places I'm already engaged is important, and also exploring new opportunities, whether they're in the works or things I'm dreaming and envisioning. A couple of those things are already in place, but others, such as considering where could I maybe connect with educational settings to influence the influencers, I guess, would be the way to encapsulate how I feel about my next steps. Think tanks or further research, consulting, just discerning what is next there. My vision for Fort Wayne is that there would be an increasing diversity of leadership, that there would be an integrated and economically just neighborhoods, that there would be just distribution of resources, opportunity, information, and representation, and that the church would continue to be transformed in mission and vision toward shalom building and in discipleship, so that our community can truly become not just the pretty pictures that we see in the postcards, but that everybody's lived experiences can be as beautiful as they can be as well. And that concludes my presentation on why disparity matters.
All right. Thank you, Angie. Very well done. Concise and
Thank you.
very nice graphics, too. I really liked it. Yeah. All we need to do is spend a little time then and thinking about what Angie has told us, thinking about her project, what you thought of the project, questions, topics, issues that you'd like to bring forth that we can possibly discuss. So I'm going to give you all the floor right now, and I'm going to listen a little bit. Make sure you turn on your microphone before you talk.
So just to clarify, we can ask our questions at this point.
Absolutely.
So Angie, I would like to know, I hope it's okay if I go first. I would like to know what in this process was one of the most significant things that you discovered. So whether in your research or conversation, but what for you was the most significant?
Well, you mean in terms of the information that I gleaned or the experience about it?
Either one. What was the most significant for you as you were moving towards answering your question and looking at that?
I think it's hard to nail down the most. I think that there were several, but as I highlighted in the presentation, I think that housing was one that really jumped out at me. Just our housing practices over the course of the history of our nation, really, the role that housing played and property ownership, the role that has played, both in how power and money have influenced the way our society has been shaped, was really interesting to me. And I think it actually helped connect a lot of dots for me as well. Recognizing I had been familiar with redlining before, but just digging in deeper and looking at the way the language even in those practices was accepted and used in establishing the sense of the other in our communities. Specific language targeted towards the labels at the time were Negroes or immigrants and associated with a detrimental influence in our neighborhoods. So I think that just knowing that we have that evidence was significant to me, and how we don't talk about those things. For some reason, it's a forgotten element of our history. And so when we're talking about community development, how often do the leaders in our cities really worked to understand that when we have segregated neighborhoods, that is a trickle down kind of effect, if you want to call it that, in how everything else is structured then in our communities. It affects our schools, it affects funding in schools, but also what types of investments come into different neighborhoods, which type of businesses will root themselves there. It affects access to jobs and transportation within our communities. It's so holistically impactful in our communities, and I don't know how many of our leaders in our cities spend time trying to understand that. And so even the net worth of families is impacted by property and what they own. So when, in my data in my paper, it talks about the difference between the net worth and household income. And the net worth is so significantly disparate between white households and everybody else. And regardless of what current household incomes might be, but we look at net worth and it's so significant. So I really do see things holistically. I think it kind of cemented that for me. I've always been a thinker that thinks holistically, but I think there's evidence to point to why it's important to even start to view it that way. And listening to people in economics or in their own little compartments, how much do they all talk together when they're trying to talk about policy and practices within the communities or nationally? I don't know how much communication between those groups takes place in trying to understand that instead of just targeting individual things often.
Thank you.
So that's one piece.
I had a quick follow-up question, but I just wanted to know, I was really struck by the slide where you talked about the disparity between housing home values based on the zip code.
Yeah.
I don't know if you heard, but a condemned home in San Francisco in the Bay Area just sold for $1.5 million. So I was just thinking, oh my gosh, the difference.
I know. It's crazy. Fort Wayne was just ranked, I think, the second most affordable city, in the top, 40 or something cities in the nation, because our cost of living is so low comparatively. But even in this setting, we have these disparate issues, so
it's much more attractive than LA right now, I will say.
Yeah.
I am curious though, and then I'll be quiet, but as you were doing your research on the redlining and figuring out, what was done, especially you were talking about during the New Deal, was it hard to uncover some of that data as you were trying to look at where the policies were first shaped and formed, or was it pretty accessible?
When I first started to kind of look into this, I want to say it was, it's probably been at least 2 or 3 years ago when I first started to dig into some of these things through the coursework that I had at BGU. And at that point, there were some resources that I ended up also utilizing throughout, but there were 2 or 3 other sources that weren't yet accessible. And one of them was the Mapping Inequality website. And that came up out of a combined project. Some of the folks were from the University of Virginia and some other academics. But that was a significant tool, I think, that is newer, that I think could be really useful for other people in their cities too. So yes and no. Some of it was more difficult than others. What was funny too, I thought was interesting, I had discovered something, I'm trying to remember which source it was now, but it wasn't yet available. It was referenced, but it wasn't yet available through the Google Docs. They will make available for free public domain material. And there was a particular resource that had become designated as public domain, but it wasn't yet accessible through Google Docs. And so I contacted and sent them an email because you can request. So I contacted and they sent me a follow-up email, and then shortly after made that one available. So I thought that was interesting, just to be able to dig something up and request it and then have it made, have it made available. So technology was pretty fascinating in that respect sometimes. But that was a journey too. It's funny that you would ask that, because figuring out how to access different types of sources was a journey in and of itself, whether it was the peer-reviewed types of articles, or if it was that type of Google Doc, public domain, or if it was books, whatever it was. It was really kind of a journey, just figuring out how to find these things. So yes and no. Some things were easy, some things were hard.
One last note, I was having a conversation with my partner in the nonprofit that I lead here in Southern California, and I was talking about your project, and my friend brought out the deed on the home that she lives in, and she indeed was in a whites only neighborhood back when the home was first built in the 40s, and the deed holds the history. So even if something is no longer, obviously we, have moved away in theory from redlining, her deed still held it. And she was very disheartened because we were talking about that history, and she was like, wow, that's even held in my deed.
Yes.
So.
I know, it's fascinating. And I was talking with one of our historic preservationists with our city. I think I would mention this to you at one point. We had like an hour and a half phone conversation one day not too long ago, and we had met before and worked a little bit on a project in the past, and I had some questions. I thought I would contact him and see what he could he inform me about such and such. And we talked, and he was fascinated. I had sent him some of the links and materials that I had dug up, but he had not yet seen the mapping inequality tool. He was familiar with the fact that there are deeds like that, but he hadn't really researched a lot of those specific documents, but he was aware of them. So yeah, same thing. And just fascinated by, like you said, there is so much history that's documented. And talking with some of my friends about it too, a couple of them had gone back and dug up some information. And not too long ago, one of her neighborhood association had recently made sure that they actually they went back and changed, even though it was no longer a practice, the documentation of that practice change hadn't taken place. And their neighborhood association had, within the last couple of years or so, I think, gone back and actually done that. So they actually physically rewrote that deed and removed all of those restrictions just to make it right. So I thought that was great.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, this was a delight to read, in that you can really write far better than I can write or even think of writing. But it was very clear, and I commend you on that.
Thank you.
You've seen a lot of articles, you've read a lot of books, you've been with a lot of people. Let me take you 20 years down the road. And the reason I say that is we walked through Fresno 20 years after H and Randy walked into the community and said, okay. Then just a couple of weeks ago, I was down 20 years after a man by the name of Jimmy Durrell. I don't know if you know the name Jimmy Durrell. I was at his dissertation oral review at Eastern Seminary 20 years ago.
Wow. And
now, just last 2 or 3 weeks ago, spent an afternoon walking through 20 years later. With your writing skill, you have the ability to picture things and to put it into words. What do you see 20 years down the line with the knowledge you have gained when Mary or someone else, Bill, needs a pickup, a reminder that what we did was significant? What do you see? What are we going to see? What are you going to show us 20 years down the line from what you've seen and what has been put in your heart today?
Well, thanks for such an easy question, Lowell. That's the the question that never leaves for me. I think, what do I see tomorrow? I think is the first question I try to answer. Honestly, I go back to my real desire is to influence the influencers. And so whatever that means, in whatever and however that manifests, my hope, I guess, would be that whatever knowledge I have that I can share and continue to share and learn, and that whole constructivist thing, continue to build on, continue to expand that knowledge and understanding. That would be one thing, to continue to do that. But as a result of that, then, to be able to impact not only the people I'm in relationship with, for example, my neighbors, part of a neighborhood conversation last night. Not everybody obviously shares my perspective of the world through the lens of faith that I have. And so how do I help my neighborhood grasp and desire shalom, for our own little community here? So within my own sphere of personal influence, I think that's one thing. 20 years from now, I hope I know that my influence has been felt and there are ripple effects from that. Just even shaping conversations about why it's good to have mixed income housing. It's okay to have rentals in our neighborhood because everybody wants what's good for their families. If they can't afford to own a home, they can at least live in a neighborhood that has some stable housing, that kind of thing. And then beyond my own personal sphere of influence, I would say organizationally or the scope of my community. As I consider now what I'm connected to already, I think, okay, where am I placed already? Where has God positioned me? And how do I leverage this in order to communicate these things and to help influence some of the way people are making decisions? I would hope that, for example, as I mentioned, more diversification within leadership, whether that means our church and growing understanding of why diversity matters, a diversification of how we lead and what the metrics are that we use for success as a result of that diversity. And then also organizations like the schools that my kids are a part of, the school district that I'm a part of an advisory group with. How can I help support and strengthen and understanding why the diversity in our city matters and how that directly affects this potentially growing disparity that we see in our community? How do we head that off? What do we do systemically that needs to change and be different? So continue to ask questions. And I guess, just as I served as the facilitator, researcher, and catalyst, I think that really, those three things really suit me well, to catalyze, to research, to communicate, to inspire in that way. So, like I say, in my neighborhood, relationally, and then also systemically in organizations in my community. I don't think I can say specifically 20 years from now, this is what will be. It's not realistic, but I think the ripple effect of that influence is what my hope is. And I have to add, though, also my children, because I think my role as a parent, I've grown to understand as a discipler. It's my job to disciple my kids. And my son, I've pulled along with this project. He's 15 now. He's been a part of this project with me in some ways. He's read things that I've done. He contributed to some of the focus group processing because he has his world that he's in. And he's a part of that demographic of half white and half non-white population in his school. And so these things are meaningful for him to consider. And so I think 20 years down the road, I hope I can see that influence in him and my daughter, who's younger still, but begin to grasp their own sense of calling and purpose in this big picture of the church and what shalom means for our community, whether it's here or if they end up somewhere else. So again, it's a ripple effect, influencing the influencers. Without being more specific than that, I guess those are my big picture views of what I hope to see 20 years from now.
Well, when God gave Moses the challenge, he said, I can't speak. You got to have somebody come with me. Mm-hmm. So if you were going to I want to ask you a little bit about the toolkit in just a minute.
Mhm.
But in implementing the toolkit in here, what team would you need to put around you in order to accomplish the influence, in order to create HB's, decided he needed not only to influence the influencers, but he had to become the power in the influence. He had to run for mayor,
Mm-hmm.
and then from that move into government,
Mm-hmm.
to bring about the changes that he had hoped for, talked about, all of that stuff. So if you're not going to necessarily do all of those things, who do you need around you? What pockets in your society do you need around you so that your influence can be more than just words, but literally can create transformation?
Right.
When you think about it.
Right. No, that's a great question. And I think that I don't think I have figured all of that out exactly yet. I think I've been working on trying to discern those things. And definitely, I think for a long time, I had been finding myself moving out of and away from being centralized within pockets of white community for a long time. And I had been kind of more surrounded by diverse populations for quite a while, which I've learned so much from and I've enjoyed. But I really think that probably over the last couple of years, I have sensed God redirecting me back into some of those pockets where it's more homogenous in terms of who's leading and who's doing what. And I really have found myself back in more of, without letting go of the other diverse relationships, but now, for example, being part of a church that's predominantly white, being connected to parts of the community that is wealthier. I think some of what I need to discern is, and continue to develop, are those relationships and the segments of our community that are in those positions of leadership and are making those decisions. So, for example, the folks that I know in the city government already, how can I continue to nurture those relationships? What is the best, vantage point? What's the best point of entry if I'm not there yet? Many times the connections, it's all about who we know and the relationships we have. And so I think that's one of the areas I've been praying and discerning about, actually, is what are those relationships that God has connected me with already, and why? And how do I love those people and not just use them towards an end? What is the nature of that relationship that we have that we share in common, whether it's faith or an understanding of what's good for people, what's good for our community, whatever that, and sincerity and integrity, I think, and discerning how do I move about my community in those ways. I really have no desire to lead an organization at this point. I think if I jump back into a system, I become part of that system. It's harder for me to be that voice that needs to speak to the systems. So I think the relational piece is something I've really been trying to discern more lately. Serving as a consultant perhaps is a better way to approach some of these settings. For example, one of our hospitals, which the hospital proximity is one of those things that surfaced in my project, and just where all of the medical community has moved. It's moved out to the outer rims of our community. And the neighborhood, services are mostly gone. They're hard to access, and they don't exist the way I think they should, where the densest population and the lowest income exist. And that's problematic in a number of ways. And I think some of them know that. I think some of the hospital community knows that, and recently have been invited into perhaps speaking with their advisory group around diversity. And that's through a relationship that was pre-existing. And a meeting of the minds and a shared passion for some of these issues. So again, it goes back to, what are the relationships that are in place? How do I continue to stay sensitive to the way the Holy Spirit is leading in that, and the ways that he would like to orchestrate and help me navigate what those things are? Becoming less intimidated by wealth and power is important to me. And I think historically that is something that has kept me silent at times because of what that power structure has been. And I think that, I've grown out of that significantly at this point. And it may be that, the timing is more ripe for some of the growth that can take place in that area, and those connections that I have, those relationships as well. So I have to be careful in our community, I think, as a woman, that works against me in the culture of our community here at times.
I would challenge that thought.
Okay.
I think missionally, Ray has said it a number of times, and he uses Jim Elliot's story as the missional example. Jim Elliot, you remember, was killed by the Elk Indians.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, you remember through Great Splendor, the last page of the book is a picture of 7 women with their children on the back of naked black men walking across the very river where the 7 men had been killed 2 years before. And Ray's statement is that some things are so dangerous that God can only afford to send women and children. And I think there is an era, and I think Mary has discovered this, that she can, being a woman is not a negative.
Right.
It is not, if you can, if you have that prophetic passion inside of you, you're not the threat that somebody else is. A male can, there's threats. It's like I used to say to churches, the smaller you are, the greater the influence you can have, because you're no threat to anybody. Nobody worries about a small little church. But if a small little church takes on a big problem, you're going to solve the problem, because God uses the small and the insignificant to confound the wise and whatever. So I would just encourage you, with your capacity and skill, your ability to put it together, maybe the greatest gift you would have is stewarding those relationships and stimulating others to that love and good work by even helping them think. Because if you can identify the people in those other sectors that need to come together, you're not putting together a look at me sort of thing. You're putting together a group that actually functions.
Right.
Power in that is, in there. Before I go out and let Bill ask you the profound questions, I'll ask another one that along this line. Your toolkit. Yeah. Where you are now.
Can I first just say thank you for your words? And I agree, and I thank you for sharing your thoughts on that. So before you move into this toolkit question, I just need to say thank you for that. I agree with you, and thank you for those words.
Okay, well, very good. Now, in the toolkit end of things, how did your research change your view that made you decide this is the kit that I want to pursue? So how did those things, the walk, I mean, let's face it, you walked in a very, in maybe one of the states where there is more anti what you're talking about than there is anywhere in the country.
Yes.
So you're walked in here in a political era that is anti what you're talking about. And so how did you then let all of that research, all of that experience select this toolkit?
I think part of that process, just based on past experience, I've learned that it's foolish of me to try to think I've got something figured out in advance and to just stay malleable. And I'm still not settled. Like I said before, I think the toolkit is ever evolving. I think it needs to be, just as we need to be, right, as people. So I think listening had a lot to do with it. I personally spent a lot of time listening to podcasts, looking up videos, researching just what would the average person have access to, and what would the average person be willing to even touch. Because I think we're talking about the average people really comprising most of our communities. And so even church leaders don't have a lot of time that they want to devote or can devote to really digging thoroughly into all of these different subject matters. And so I think I started to approach it from that angle. You know, what is accessible? What are some of the most accessible things? But then also, what are some of those things that will allow people who want to dig deeper to do so? So I try to approach it from, you know, historically, theologically, and locally, you know, from those three angles. But then also, like I said, what's accessible to people, what would allow people to dig in, what would inspire or intrigue others to motivate them to want to learn more or to be willing to even start talking about these things. And so that's where I started, I guess. I just, you know, after listening to the feedback, the experience I had with the focus group, gauging the climate on social media, trying to just perceive, you know, and discern from those different vantage points, I guess. And I think, you know, what I have so far, I know that, you know, at least some of those tools I know people have gravitated to where they have shown an interest in. We did a really small book club in February for Black History Month. There was a small group of us that gathered around that. And it was from the book. It's more like a, what do you call it? Like a coffee table book about the African Americans in Fort Wayne, the first 200 years. It's really not an academic book, but it does have a lot of good information in it. And it was an all-white group that gathered and wanted to talk about this. And so we did. And then we took a trip to our local African American museum that's here in town, you know, that same month. So, you know, things like that, because one of the things that they indicated across the board was that they wanted to talk with each other and interact with each other. And so I think that also helped inform me. How do I help bring people together to have these conversations, and what are some of those accessible tools that will allow that to happen? So, yeah.
Have you thought about taking this toolkit to, say, to someplace like Fort Wayne Bible College or a Christian University sociology department, and take in saying, hey, I'd like to teach a course here with somebody to teach them how to do research in neighborhoods, and actually take them through the neighborhoods of Fort Wayne.
Mm-hmm.
And that there might be a way of, if it's your children, and you're right. I mean, it's so dangerous or so crazy that children are going to have to be the ones to do this. You know, Randy you remember his process. He used the young emerging leader to bring about change that he could not accomplish.
Mm-hmm.
You have the capacity to do that.
Mm-hmm.
And I would hope that as you take that toolkit, that it's not just, you would think in terms of taking those young leaders. Mary's done a great job with this in her places of getting to not just change the organization, but literally that young leader, and walk
Mm-hmm.
them through the city.
Mm-hmm.
And I would hope that there'd be places there that I think you start that thinking, others are going to respond in terrific ways.
No, I think that's both helpful in terms of giving me some new ideas, but also affirming some things as well. And, I'm a part of a group we call the LIM Network. It's Local International Ministry. And a small group of us started this just a few recent years ago that connects people across cultures that are doing ministry locally. So this last quarterly meeting that we had, we took people to one of the neighborhoods where there is a pastor who's Latino, who's been developing a ministry modeled off of some of the CCDA principles. And so we brought those leaders to his location, and then we took a little tour. So, I mean, what you just said kind of affirms, some of that activity, but also it's stimulating some other thoughts for me in terms of who and where, and connecting some of those dots. So, no, those are good thoughts, and I appreciate it. I appreciate your thinking and asking and even, advising. I appreciate that.
Bill?
Yeah, let me jump in here just a little bit. I really appreciate the conversation. I've been just taking a few notes here on the little form we have to fill out. So, one of the issues in kind of wrestling with this issue just as a school, in my position now in this research, what am I called? Research project something, director. But, we kind of wrestle with the whole issue of, how really disciplined research relates to practitioner work, okay? And so I'm starting to ask students just in these sort of reviews, what have you learned about research by doing this project? What has it been a helpful project? What have you learned? What can you take with you that will actually help you, for your future work?
Mm-hmm. One thing I've learned is that I love research. I don't think I ever did. I don't think
I will attest to that. She loves research. All of our calls, I definitely saw that,
Okay.
which was a treat.
Right.
That's not typical.
Exactly.
I don't think it was typical of me in my past, like undergraduate and master's. I did iSearch. It was, it was Claremont Graduate University, and it was very, practitioner based. It was iSearch. So it wasn't as academic as what something, like this or other disciplines do. And I think because it was so meaningful for me, this whole BGU experience for me has just been so meaningful. And so because of that, I think the context of meaning allowed me to dig into research in a way that was significant to me, and it wasn't just to suit someone else's need or expectation or just to check it off because the class required it. It was because it had to do with life. It had to do with my own life and my own sense of calling. And so what I've discovered is that I love research. I would love to do more, and I'd love to be connected to more people who do it because I want to get better at it. I think one of the things about research that I learned is that there's a lot of information out there. And so sometimes it can get tricky to know how to find what it is you're looking for. Just even the question of, has anybody studied this? Even today, I was listening to a podcast about early childhood education because education was part of my background, and it intrigued me to hear what they had to say about some of this. And I was listening to the studies and the conclusions, and I had questions about it. Well, has anybody studied this to see if that would hold true over here? So I think getting to the root of the issue is something that's always been a part of who I am, but I don't know that I've always had the complete package of, putting it together for a reason and then being able to say, okay, this is why this is meaningful. So that's one answer, I guess.
Right.
Overall, I think I would say my experience for this project is both, yes, you become an expert of sorts, but it really just kind of it makes you feel like you know less. You realize I really don't know much at all when you think about how much is out there to know and to understand. There's just so much more to dig into. And so, yes, I feel like it's an accomplishment, but on the other hand, I feel like I've just scratched the surface.
Yeah, that's good. I was in a conversation earlier today with another student and a few of us, and we were just talking. He's over in working in the Philippines. Well, you know him, Theo Lowell.
Yeah.
And, you know, he's doing a project, you know, in some very violent kinds of communities. You know, and we were kind of talking about the temptation as a practitioner. I want to just jump in and start making something happen, right? That's our nature, is we don't want to think too much. We want to make it happen.
Yeah.
But you know, I was really challenged by a couple other people who are on that call with me that we need to discover what we don't know in order to do something adequately and well. If we just jump in and start trying to do our practitioner thing without really having knowledge and facts, then we have a greater chance of failing. And so, I mean, what I appreciated by what you were doing was just the amount of demographic research that you were doing. It really caused you to look into your community and just really dig into facts, so that you now have a base of knowledge to speak from when you are called upon to talk about what you're doing in the area of diversity, disparity. Those issues, you can now speak with a little more authority because you've done that research. That's good.
Thank you for saying that. And I was reflecting back on my proposal, and I remember stating I wanted to feel as though I could speak with being informed enough to speak with integrity about the subject.
Right.
And I still think that there are gaps. I still think I'd really like to understand, some of these things a little better and more deeply, but definitely, I do feel much more confident about being able to speak into some of these things and, being able just, like you said, facts. And I think that was something I just felt like we're not all operating off of the same understanding of what the facts are.
Right.
And that convolutes the conversations. And then we can't get to the application because we all are coming at it from presuppositions that are different and faulty. And so I remember my philosophy class years ago. The one thing I walked away from in that philosophy class was, if you're going to argue something, argue from presuppositional basis. And so I think in a lot of ways, that's how I've approached a lot of things since then, is let's get to the presuppositions. What do we know or think we know? And are they true? And so, yeah. Yeah,
that's good. Yeah. Well, like I said, I appreciate that very much. Let me just say one other comment, and this is kind of from the practitioner hat. Okay. Like you said, the group that you worked with was it was all white, right?
Yes. Well, with the exception of one Asian American male.
Okay. Yeah.
Chinese American.
As a school at BGU, we've really functioned on the whole approach of using plunges, into situations where we expose ourselves to people's situations that are totally and completely different from ourselves. Right. And so I'm thinking, it seems like that approach to be able to get a group out of their comfort zone, to meet with others who are on a totally different wavelength. To me, that's what we do as facilitators. We bring people together, and then we have to function as facilitator, of course. And when I used to do marriage counseling, that was always happening, two people that are totally opposite on their perspectives on something, and then we're trying to moderate that whole process.
Yes.
That, the kind of area you're working in, what a wonderful thing to be able to do, to facilitate relationship among people who have not been accustomed to relating to, people that are very unlike ourselves.
Right.
Yeah.
My original group, my invitation that was extended included a variety. There were a couple of Latinos that were invited, and then also African Americans. I remember about 4 or 5 African Americans, and just one of them moved to South Africa. 2 of them moved to different cities. Another had a family crisis, and so the circumstances just kind of conspired to shape the group as it did. And one of my members is not a professing Christian, but she's very deeply involved in her community and has a lot of respect for people of faith that she says walk the talk. And so very friendly towards what the project was about. And so, she was happy to participate in it. So anyway, the group itself was very diverse in terms of, upbringings, backgrounds, but in terms of being a part of the majority population, everybody pretty much came from that experience. But the issue is something then they're not always confronting. And so I almost think that the fact that it ended up being an all-white group, one, may have made it safer for them to be honest without fear of retribution or judgment about what they said, perhaps. I'm not sure. That's a possibility. But then also, the fact that it's disparity for most of them is not something that they're always confronted with or always having to deal with in the systems. And the responses they gave evidence to that, both from privilege and disadvantage, a highly privileged group, not so much disadvantaged group. And so the fact that they were willing to come around this project and discuss it and think about it and contemplate some things, some of them were a little more prepared for it than others just because of their backgrounds and their affinity towards the subject. And then other people were a little newer to the conversation. And so there was some, diversity in that respect, but
right.
Yeah.
No, that's good. Yeah. Hey, Joe, you've been living with Angie through this whole process. Can you add any more light to what's been happening here as you've been kind of watching this process go from your perspective?
Well, first of all, I want to thank you for your investment, each one of you. It's been life-giving to Ange, and I think that she has grown so much through this whole process, and I think that we've lived in our neighborhood on purpose for about 10 years. And I think that she is better equipped, and we both are, because, some of this rubs off. And for me, it's really been eye-opening, and I've kind of done some more reading, and I'm not a reader, but it's encouraged me to do some more research and reading into areas where that are related on different fronts, and so to disparity, and it really opens your eyes up to, all the why neighborhoods are the way they are, why things are run the way they are, and it's invaluable, really, and I can't. It's hard to put words onto it because it's been a growing experience for me, and like Angie said, with our son, he's been able to participate, and we were up till, I forget, 10:30 last night, going through slides for the presentation today, and just offering edits and that kind of thing. So the fact that he's able to walk alongside with his mom, I think has been a really good thing for him as well. And that's kind of my 2 cents on it.
All right. Well, thank you. Yeah. It's always good to kind of hear how things are affecting a family. One of the things I wrote down here, we have a question on how do they see themselves as a transformational, incarnational change agent. And you mentioned some areas, but the desire to motivate your own kids in this whole area of diversity, that to me, that was just a great point. Yeah.
Bill, I don't want to lose the thought that she
Go ahead.
brought up just a second ago, and I agree wholeheartedly with what you just said about this effect of the family. And Joe, your response is great to that whole process. Angie, have you read anything of Father Ben Beltran? Mary, have you read his work at all? Ben has written a book, a number of them, but he's written one called The Christology of the Inarticulate. And he basically is in a Roman Catholic country, all Roman Catholic. And he said the church has tried to go in and communicate with them, and the only problem is They have no idea what the theology of what the people really believe about Christ. And so he had to go research what they really believed in order to give the church a message that could transform the unbelief.
Mm-hmm.
And I think what you have here is the basis of that kind of book. That you could sit down and say, here is what what is it that you really believe as you listen in this process? What do you really believe about disparity? What do you really believe about power, about money, about neighborhoods? What is it that really is the underlying? It's not what you think, it's what what we think. You can't communicate to somebody until you know that stuff that's back there that's so foundational, but it doesn't mesh with what is actually talked about or written. Yeah. So I would hope that you would take this research and say, this is what our city really thinks about power, and why it thinks about disparity, and why it thinks about why our neighborhoods here. I mean, I think it would be a great tool to think, but I'd encourage you to just look at how he did his research in there, because he everybody is a Roman Catholic. Everybody believed in Jesus, except they had no idea who the Jesus was they believed in. Mm-hmm. And I think that's exactly what you're in a prime area to do that kind of thing sociologically in the whole area of housing and bringing these three circles together. I think it'd be fascinating with your skill.
I wrote down the title because I'm familiar with his name, but I don't know why. I don't remember if I've read something or not. But
he is just probably the most amazing leader in the Philippines.
Okay.
Unbelievable what he has done to bring about change. 30 years. If you ever heard about Smoky Mountain, the transformation he brought into the worst garbage dump in the middle of Manila, 30,000 people living on garbage, literally living on the garbage.
Okay.
And created the change and the economic development and the kids. I mean, it's just amazing what he did for the whole culture. But he had to find out what they really believed in order to shape the change that was needed to bring the transformation. Now, he lived in the garbage dump, and so he learned firsthand, did that, his research. But that it's not little, it's a fascinating book, because it's what they believed is not what the textbooks say a Christian should believe.
When you say that, well, first, that story, that sounds familiar, and so I think that's why I know his name. But I'll have to look at that book specifically. But what you say is so true. I think I experienced that the deeper I dove into just being able to formulate and articulate my own sense of theology around this, and have a deeper understanding of why do I believe this is true or not true, I started to feel like I was encountering that difference so much more distinctly then, and being able to point to, even with it on a Sunday morning, for example, I think the things that I intuitively was sensing over the years, what was going on, but now I can begin to point to what are we missing in that message, for example. This is the message that's being sent, but what aspect of that message is missing? And so now when I hear the fullness of the message, I think that that scripture gives us, my ears just perk up so much differently at this point. So what you just described, I think, it resonates with me in terms of saying, understanding what they believe. And I think that was some of my question. It was just like what I said before, we're not, the presuppositions are off. We're not talking about the same things here.
Right.
So what are we talking about? Like what you just said. But I hadn't thought about it that way before. So that's interesting.
And the other one that I thought of, and was thinking, it was Brad Smith's lecture on the abuse of. It's love, sex, power, and money. It's the abuse of there's nothing wrong with sex. There's nothing wrong with power. There's nothing wrong with money. But it's the abuse of, the love of, that creates the danger. So how do you take something that which is good and abuse it? And the systems in the city have done some abusing. So how do you get back to what is good and get rid of the abuse of, to bring about transformation? And I think that I see as part of the stuff that you have in here.
Yeah. No, yeah, I think that's so true. And I began to connect that idea with the whole notion of stewardship. You know,
Yeah.
what are we expected to be or do as stewards? What do we have to be willing to let go of? And then how do we manage what we've been given? You know, it's convicting, because none of us do it perfectly. And so it's peeling away those different layers and trying to recognize and point to where we encounter that both within ourselves, but then also, how we see it happening in our community around us. And I mentioned earlier, even that neighborhood conversation last night, and we want to address the sidewalk issue. We have horrible sidewalks on our street. They're dangerous. And the city doesn't pay for that. We have to, as homeowners, we have to somehow figure, well, we live in a neighborhood that not everyone can afford to do that. So it's troubleshooting, right? But, one of the families, is we want to make sure our house values increase. We want our home values to be, we want our house to be an investment. So I think I go back to that whole notion of, housing has become an investment. Well, how is that an abuse of stewardship at times? Because that becomes our primary interest in where we live. And is that really stewarding what we've been asked to steward, in all of our cities? Sometimes we need to think about it differently. And that's a tough challenge because it's so ingrained in our culture.
Yeah.
Even among really great Christian people, it's hard for us sometimes to be willing to let go of those things that we just accept as, well, that's a good idea because I'm stewarding my resources. I'm earning money. I'm supposed to earn money. But at what cost to others? And so all of those things are just, bigger issues, and how do we tackle that? And it's a challenge. I find myself, on the one hand, I feel so much more empowered, but on the other hand, I look and I go, oh, this is a much bigger mountain than I thought, so what tools do I need to climb it? But, and that's part of figuring all of that out.
Yeah.
So, yeah, thanks for your thoughts on that.
All right. I'm going to, I guess, be the timekeeper out, and then I'll send it to you. Let's see, what else do I have here?
And then you're just going to, if we're okay with it, you're just going to add our signatures or have Judy do it?
Well, you guys can just okay it by email.
Got it.
I'll copy it to you and Lowell and Judy, and then we can all just,
Okay.
give an email acceptance.
Fantastic.
Okay, let's see. I'll take Angie off hold. I'll take Joe off hold. Angie and Joe, you're back with us? You'll have to turn on your microphone.
Yes.
All right, cool.
Yes. I only see the little screen. So I don't.
Yeah, I think he's
Okay.
still
Let
doing
me
a
stop
share
sharing
screen.
so that will bring.
Okay.
There we go.
There, yeah.
There we go. All right. Okay, Mary, go ahead.
Great. So we just had our conversation together and discussed your project, and I get to have the privilege and the honor of being the first person to say congratulations, Dr. Angela Harrison. We have passed you with distinction on your dissertation, so we are very proud of your work and just wanted to say congratulations. So
Thank you.
we applaud you.
Thank you.
Amen.
Thank
Yeah.
you all.
Very exciting.
Oh, yay. Okay. Well, it'll sink in later.
It's going to take a while. I know.
Yeah.
We've been on this journey for a while, right? So it's weird
Yeah.
to have it coming to a close. I mean, it's just
Mhm.
the end of one part of the
Yeah.
journey.
You
So,
guys need to go
Yes. But
celebrate.
this season. Yes.
Yeah.
yes, please make sure to not read a book tonight and celebrate.
That's right. Yeah.
I know, right?
No,
Yes, we have plans. We're going to our favorite Mexican restaurant. here in a
Good.
little
All
while,
right.
So,
Great.
Yeah.
yes.
And I think I would say to you, there are two parts of this. There's the written part, and there's the oral presentation. And we had to evaluate, both of those. And there are very few that do both with incredible skill.
Mhm.
And not only to articulate, but how you articulate, how you thought, how you answered, how you applied. And I think Bill and I have done scores of these over the last 10 years, 12 years, and Mary has as well. I think it's safe to say that you would be in that Hall of Fame section of both.
Mhm.
Wow.
What you have put into writing, but also what you put into into showing it, into telling it. The show and tell portion of this was just as, I hope you don't underestimate your capacity to communicate something really vital.
Yeah.
Because you have the gift to do that.
Absolutely.
And you did it extremely well. So thank you.
Thank you.
And an incredible standard of excellence you have set. So I've talked about your integration and how you were able to bring your experience, but also your gifting, but a standard of excellence. And that is a treat for all of us. That's a gift when we get to listen and be a part of somebody who has that standard of excellence. So thank you.
I'm not really sure what to say.
You just take it in. You'll let it sit in for a while. So
Yeah. No, we do. I'll just say amen to what Lowell and Mary have said. And same thing. I've just looked at a lot of projects and just really yours is in a high standard, very high standard. And I also want to say too, I think we've already said it, but you do have the ability to take complex issues and communicate them in such a way that others can understand, and that'll be such a great asset to what you're trying to do. As you're trying to communicate information. But just your use of communication tools was very helpful. Thanks. Thank you very much, Angie. And then just your own spirit. Okay. Yeah, God has just given you, I think, the right spirit to be able to function in the role that you would desire to work in.
And let's get that book published.
Amen. Yeah,
let's make it a workbook. Let's make it,
Right.
Not tonight, though, and not tomorrow.
Right, yeah.
Tonight it's Mexican restaurant, right?
That's right.
Yes.
All right, guys.
No,
Well,
I just thank you so much. You all are cheerleaders, and I thank you. Lowell, you always have something nice to say. And
he does.
I just have appreciated that from the beginning. And yeah, it's been about 4 years since I first contacted anybody at BGU about this. And so thank you for that, sharing that gift of yours. And and Mary, I said, just, it's been great. Like, I've loved working with you, and I appreciate just like the kinship that's come out of this as well. I think, just sharing some common concerns and care about our world and our community. And I appreciate
Feeling
that.
is absolutely mutual with you. So.
And I don't know, do I call you Dr. Payne or Bill? I don't know.
We all call him Dr.
Because you're both.
I actually like Bill. Yeah.
And I see the guitars back there, so that tells me we share music in common as well.
Do we?
And,
Okay. Yeah, I do.
Yes.
Keyboard and guitar. Yeah, those are kind of my areas.
See? And my husband and I are both musicians, and but no, your guidance through the whole process was invaluable to me, and both, all of you, just every piece that you brought to the equation for me was so helpful, and just your vote of confidence, because I don't know, I just do what I do, and you don't always know if you're, how you're doing on anything. Yeah. And so I just, thank you for all of your feedback.
Let this be a full affirmation of that.
Thank you.
That little statement, I just do what I do. It's on about 1,000 high school uniforms across the country. Do what we do. Not what the other people out there do. Do what we do is the model of building teams.
Right.
And so you fit the. I mean, that's exactly right. You've done what you've done, and you've done it in a way that will allow others to share in it. So thank you for that.
Mhm.
Amen.
All right.
Well, with that, I think we're going to close this session.
Yes.
Yeah. You had
Okay.
a good talk, good encouragement, good fellowship.
Absolutely.
Yeah, this was fun.
It was,
You were right, Lowell. It was fun. In your email, you said it should be fun. So thank you. It was.
We'll be in touch soon.
we will
Thanks.
indeed.
Okay.
All
All
right.
right.
Goodbye, everybody.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye bye.
Right.